Thank you for joining the Art Gallery of Regina for a recorded discussion about how artists represent plants in comparison with specimens from the George F. Ledingham Herbarium's collection. This fall, the Art Gallery of Regina invites the public to connect to the knowledge that we are all electric beings through free participatory events for the public, of which this talk is one. The four artists, Shillinglaw, Laurel Terlesky, Rachel Broussard, and Alyssa Ellis, participating in this discussion will also exhibit their work in the Art Gallery of Regina's main gallery exhibition, We Are All Electric Beings, opening Thursday, October 13th. Through media as diverse as performance, textiles, electronics, drawing, ceramics, collage, and sculpture, the artists in We Are All Electric Beings address the complex biology of plants and the interconnectedness of all species. Accompanied by images of their artworks, these artists will discuss the reasons they value plants depicted in their artworks, how their representation methods reveal unseen or unknown qualities of their botanical subjects, and how knowledge conveyed by artworks complements that of Western scientific ways of knowing. Taking the plants and environments addressed in each artist's work, Mel Hart, a member of the George F. Ledingham Herbarium Committee at the University of Regina, provides insights into a biologist's approach to plants. Dr. Hart will share dried plant specimens from the herbarium's collection, as well as tools and methodologies employed by biologists. Conversation between artist and biologist will also touch on the differences between their disciplines. For example, while botanical specimens must be uniform in presentation, art is characterized by novelty and invention. Artists and biologists will also discuss their shared understandings of evolution, cultivation, extinction, domestication, and ecology. For instance, artist Laurel Terlesky's botanical drawings illuminate when touched, making visible the fact that all living beings carry an electrical charge on the surface of their cells. Artist Shillinglaw stitches a record in thread of traditional knowledge passed on to her from a family member and elder in her large-scale embroideries, medicine plants foraged by her ancestors. Artist and horticulturalist Alyssa Ellis delves into the codependent relationship of care between humans and houseplants. Rachel Broussard uses animal and plant bodies cut from the pages of scientific textbooks to spell messages of environmental doom, recognizing the interconnectedness and vulnerability of all species in an ecosystem. I'm Sandy Moore. I'm the curator of exhibitions and programming at the Art Gallery of Regina. And I recognize that this land is not a commodity, but alive and filled with living things. As a white settler heritage person, an uninvited guest on these lands, I am grateful to have the opportunity to form a relationship of mutual respect with these lands, their human and non-human inhabitants. By acknowledging the traditional lands referred to as Treaty 4 territory, I recognize the strength and the wisdom of the place that has given rise to the people of that land and invoke the spirit of this place to support the gallery's good intentions. The Art Gallery of Regina is located on Treaty 4 territory, the original lands of the Cree, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Dakota, Nakota, Lakota, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. While we meet today on a virtual platform, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of all lands, which we each call home. Shillinglaw resides on Treaty 6 territory within the Métis homelands and Métis Nation of Alberta Region 4. This land is the traditional territory of many First Nations, such as the Nehea, Dene, Nakota Sioux, Anishinaabe, and Blackfoot. Artist and horticulturist Alyssa Ellis joins us from the traditional territories of the Blackfoot First Nations tribe of Siksika, Piikani, Ganaina, and the Stoney Nakoda First Nations of Chiniki, Bearspaw, Wesley, and Sioux-Tana First Nation. She resides in the city of Calgary, which is also the homeland of the historic Northwest Métis and Métis Nation, Alberta Region 3. Laurel Terlesky makes her home on the traditional unceded territories of the Sinixt and Ktunaxa nations known as Nelson, BC. Since 2017, Rachel Broussard has created on Treaty 6, which encompasses the traditional territories of numerous First Nations, including Cree, Dene, Nakota, Saulteaux, Ojibwe, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect and honor the treaties that were made on all territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we are committed to moving forward in partnership with Indigenous nations in the spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. I invite you to join me in a moment of reflection to acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and to consider how we can move forward in the spirit of healing, reconciliation, and collaboration with each other, the land, and the environment. The Art Gallery of Regina is committed to free, accessible events, including this conversation. I want to acknowledge the financial support of SAS Culture, which has made this activity possible through its Culture Days funding. The Art Gallery of Regina is grateful to its core funders, SaskArts, and the City of Regina. I am especially grateful to Dr. Mel Hart for partnering with the Art Gallery of Regina to share her expertise and the George F. Ledingham Herbarium's collection with us. And I would like to introduce Mel. Mel Hart moved to Treaty 4 in 2015. Her years prior were spent in the unceded territories of the Comox people on Vancouver Island and in the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations in Vancouver. Mel's PhD research was on sound production and detection in a mosquito and 3 species of moss. However, her interests range beyond insects to all things nature-related. She has dabbled in vertebrate skeletal preparation and is currently one of a team looking after the George F. Ledingham Herbarium at the University of Regina. In her role of Associate Dean in Science, Mel has taken the opportunity to bring more attention to the herbarium by initiating a project focused on digitizing the collection to make it available to anyone who wishes to explore the treasures it contains.
Thank you, Sandy, and I look forward to all our conversations.
It is my pleasure to introduce one of the 4 artists exhibiting in the exhibition We Are All Electric Beings. Heather Shillinglaw gives material form to oral histories and traditional knowledge using textile practices such as quilting and tufting. Shillinglaw traces her Indigenous ancestry to Cold Lake First Nation through her mother, a residential school survivor. Her process includes learning and using the Nehiyawak language to understand ancestral philosophies and cultivate a relationship with the land. A graduate of the Alberta College of Art and Design, Shillinglaw has exhibited her artwork at national and international venues, including the Canadian Embassy in Buenos Aires, Argentina, Petrofi Irodalmi Museum and New Budapest Gallery, Royal Alberta Museum London, and the Museum of Contemporary Art Calgary.
So in this slide that we have here, this is part of a body of work that is going to be shown in the exhibition. It's the first time I've ever shown this work, so I'm super excited. It's kind of quilting on steroids, and in this piece, it's based off of the philosophies of Wapison, which means moss bag. Asta taska kam kawa. Now I'm just learning the Nehiyawak Cree language, so my apologies if we have any Cree speakers out there and I've just made it sound really bad. I'm rediscovering the language because my mother has lost the language. So in this piece, yeah, so that's the moss, and carrying that history of the matrilineal line and the plants that we used to heal ourselves for mind, body, and spirit, and to help us in the home back in the days when we didn't have a Shoppers Drug Mart or a Walmart to go to get medicines or food sources. So looking at that matrilineal line. Next slide. And in part of my holistic way of looking at things, I examine things in a historical context. And looking at fiber in the traditions of the way that they used plants and the way that they studied them in their artistic eye. So this is a very old piece that was from the Royal Alberta Museum. And there's some text in there that tells the story. And I worked with Emma Knight and Ruth McConnell, who had also helped me with Elder Shirley Norris Shillinglaw, who's my mother. She's from the Cold Lake First Nations Reserve. And part of this is the study of tufting. So it's actually hairs that are gathered and tufted together. And in the previous slide, the moss and some of my other works that will be on display where I challenge that philosophy using more of an eco resource and materials using yarn instead of hair. Next slide. So in this slide, this one here is where I'm looking at the land and I'm observing all the plants that I've learned from the teachings from my mother, and what type of plants that we carried in our medicine bags, because they're a long history of medicine women, so they utilize that landscape to help heal the family and the community. And in this one here, Sapatetiu, which means she looks over the meadow, and it's from the Sears Manahasio Meotaman, which she harvests in a good road. So I'm trying to think of that medicine bag and moving on the trails through the land, into the land, and harvesting. Next slide. I come from a tradition of painting, so I'm a painter that's turned to an art quilter, and this piece is called Handful of Roses. It's part of the Cowboys and Indian Quilt series that is at the Art Gallery of Alberta at the Art and Rental Sales. So this is more of my commercial works, and it's part of a Nukukums quilt. So again, that's an older work that I still keep reintroducing the same subject, but in a different way. Next slide. And this one here is called Moose Snack from the series Seeds from the Past. And in this body of work where I've done for many, many years, where I've stitched onto felting, and I've made like a observing the beads to connect to the past. So every time I thread, every time I sew, it's that connection to the matrilineal line. So that stitch and sew is that connection to my Nukukums, my grandmothers. And it's an ongoing series as well. Next slide. And this is another one, Band-Aids Beauty. And it's also like thinking about the Band-Aids that we have, the natural Band-Aids. This is like something that I would use on a skin knee right from when I was little, hiking in the bush with my mom. And my mother quickly grabbed a little bit of the leaf and rubbed it with her hands and then put it over top of the wound. So it's like the Band-Aids Beauty. That's why I call it the Band-Aids Beauty. There's also many different medicinal sources from these plants and flowers.
Heather, thank you so much for sharing that brief insight into your work. I'm so excited for people to see your work in person. There's so much rich texture and detail, but it was also really thrilling for me even to learn about how this plant is actually something that is like a wound salve or a Band-Aid from out in the wild. I think that really is exciting knowledge to me. So I want to thank you so much for sharing that. And I also want to invite Mel Hart to bring in her perspective as a biologist and some examples of works from the herbariums collection as well.
Thank you, Sandy. And thank you very much, Heather, for sharing your stories and your knowledge about these plants. I find it really interesting because I was brought up in a very Eurocentric form of science. And so, you know, a lot of focus is on categorizing plants and animals, everything basically in the living world, and putting them into different groups trying to understand their relationships, but maybe not in the way that we think of plants and animals as our own relations, but in terms of how they connect to one another. The moss piece really spoke to me because I grew up on the West Coast and I would go into the forests and there would be these lush mats of greenery, and just seeing your piece made me even smell that memory. And in comparison, the pieces that we have of moss in the herbarium collection look rather sad because the pieces are squashed, they're flattened. We use plant presses to collect everything. And then they lose their color a bit. And so the moss loses that rich texture that you see out in nature. It is nice to know, though, that when people go to study the mosses, you have to rehydrate them a bit to bring back that springiness and that 3D texture. So we don't do that for all the plants. You don't rehydrate them, but mosses are one of those special cases. So here, you just, in comparison to your, oh no, please advance the slide, Sandy, that's great. In comparison to that 3D texture that I can see in your work, the specimens that we have in the herbarium reflect that flat, going to be kept on a shelf nature that we have for our specimens. And just for people who don't know specimen collection for herbariums, this is kind of fun. You'll see in some of the later pictures, the plants are taped out on pieces of paper. Mosses aren't collected that way. They're stored in little envelopes. So at the herbarium, we have cupboards and cupboards full of tiny envelopes with a whole bunch of collection detail on each of those envelopes. So a lot of information packed in there.
Can I add one thing that I forgot to mention about the moss? What part of the story that my mother shared with me is that the moss is like a very important thing in the forest in that it supports the tree. So she talked a lot about that relationship with the moss living on the tree or beside the tree to the tree. So they support one another as specimens. That's the way she explained it to me. I don't know if that's the case in biology. Do you know, can you speak to that at all?
I am a biologist who believes that everything is connected, and having those moss mats, they're going to help with the stability of the soil. And so I can see them being a supportive nature for that environment.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so it's the same idea, but for the way my mother explained it is that there's a relationship, almost like a kinship to one another.
Yeah, and that's the part that's not really up to speed yet in biology, unfortunately. The historical view of a lot of scientists have taken away that spirit connectedness, and I see now some of that coming into science a bit more.
Interesting.
I'm going to move on to, yes, the nice smooth aster. I like this one in response to the overall collection of plants that would be in a medicine bag, partly because I couldn't show all the images in connection to the specimens in your piece, but also because I like the problem that this shows that collectors encounter. We're very rigid a lot in biology, and so for collecting, the specimens have to fit on the sheet or in a very specific way on a number of sheets. So the collector of this specimen has carefully bent the specimen to make sure that the entire plant does feature on the sheet. And they're supposed to flip the leaves so you can see some leaves that are upside down, some that are right side up. They've kept the root intact. And I like that the color has stayed true in this one. Oftentimes the specimens fade. Now I chose this one. We do have a lot of prairie specimens in the herbarium. Dr. Ledingham was deeply appreciative of the prairie environment. And so he recognized the value of the prairie ecosystem, and he made sure to collect and document that, because he saw that with people coming in and the growth of farming, that the landscape was changing, and he wanted to make sure there was a record of those native plants. So we have the smooth aster there. Thanks to Dr. Ledingham's collecting activities, all the plants there are represented in our collection. Perhaps not the tobacco. Is there tobacco in there, Heather?
No, I do not have tobacco. Tobacco does not grow in this region.
Okay, then perfect. We're right in line with each other, because that would not be in our collection either. All right, next one. This one shows some of that fading that happens. So this is a wild rose, and I liked how this connected to the quilting, because in the piece that you showed, Heather, I could see those thorns, and it's kind of a problem that we encounter when taking specimens and preserving them, because we also preserve some of the, well, all those features. So we end up with the thorns, we end up with the jagged bits. Everything that you see out in nature gets brought into the herbarium and gets trapped in those specimens. And you can see here, a rose is a big plant. So in the collecting rules, we don't take the entire plant, we take representative cuttings. It would take way too many herbarium sheets to fit a specimen onto it. And there we go. You can see those nice little prickles that show up, and they do hold true into the biological specimens as well. But the color in your piece is much richer than what you see in the dried specimen.
And can I tell you that the thorns, the thorny part, the really thick stems, they're actually used for birch bark baskets when you're making a really strong basket. So they're very strong. And
Oh,
I don't know if you knew that.
no, I didn't know that. I can imagine that they would be strong though, but the thorns aren't an issue?
Well, no, you strip the thorns,
Okay.
of course. But, you know, I didn't say this, but you can actually, for medicines, you can utilize the entire plant for use of medicines. So it's a very spiritual and sacred plant.
And it's, yeah, I've heard about rose hips being used. I didn't know about the stems. See, I love these events because I learn things, and every day that I learn is a good day. Thank you, Heather. Next slide, please, Sandy. Oh, yes, this is an example of the fireweed from our collection. And I liked this one because, again, the collector had to bend it very carefully to fit it onto the page. They've collected part of the root system. Roots and bulbs are collected in certain circumstances, if possible. Care is taken when harvesting a plant. People go out, they take shovels, trowels. You'll see some of the collecting gear in a few slides when I'm having later conversations. And this one, again, like I said, the color doesn't always keep true. And I really like that you could see it in comparison. Oh, flipping's good. Thank you, Sandy, if you want to flip the slide, because you can see the richness. This dried specimen is a darker sort of purple, but there's still that idea of that deep, rich color that you see in Heather's piece. And from a biology perspective, I always like fireweed because it's one of those specimens that comes in after fire or after a clearing, and it shows an important role in the ecosystem because it claims a space, it serves its purpose, and then it is succeeded by another plant that comes in later. So it adds to a nice linear story in nature. And then we have yarrow. we have lots of yarrow in the collection, and it's interesting. We have different color morphs. So we have the yarrow that I selected in response to the yarrow in Heather's piece with, if you want to flip, Sandy, please, just to show the white with that traditional yellow center. But we do also have yarrow that have pink flowers, and I believe we also have some purple specimens in the collection. So it really shows the varieties that are out there. And I think that a lot of people overlook yarrow, but it's really one of those beautiful plants when you take the time and look at that floral formation that's more evident in Heather's piece with the showing the umbel and all the different little flowers. When you look really closely, and people who are collecting the plants for the herbarium, they often use dissecting microscopes and magnifying glasses to look at those small details, because they're really crucial in identifying one plant from another.
Well, thank you both, Heather and Mel. I'm already delighted because this has been so informative, and I wonder if either of you have any final comments before we move on to the next artist. But of course, we will hopefully all come together for a discussion following these presentations as well.
I had one question. In your collection, you said you have like pinks in pink yarrows. I've never seen them in this region of pink yarrows or when I was harvesting.
And I've never seen them out in the wild either. So I'd have to go look at from where they were collected, but all that information is on the specimen. So I'm happy to look that up and share it with you.
I'm just curious, that's all.
All right, well, thank you both. I will ask Rachel Broussard now to join us and share some of her practice with us. Rachel Broussard, originally from Lafayette, Louisiana, is a multimedia artist based on Treaty 6 territory. She creates surreal, immersive sculptural collage environments sourced from nature photography books. Harnessing uncanny beauty, her artworks address hunger for the exotic, climate anxiety, and grief. Broussard holds an MFA from the University of Saskatchewan and a BA in Studio Arts from St. Edward's University, Austin, Texas. They work as technical director at Paved Arts and as a program guide at the Ramey Modern.
All right, hello everybody. It's great to be here to have this discussion with you all today. So this is an example of the work I'll be showing at the AGR for this exhibition. And it's from the series I'm calling Climate Anxiety. So I source most of my materials from nature books that I find secondhand. And so these are all photographs that I cut from those books and collage to form the letters to spell fear. So creating these works as a way to externalize some of the fear and anxiety I have when considering our planet and the future we're facing in terms of the climate crisis. Like, these works were made mostly from Canadian wildlife books. Like this one, you'll mostly see the loons appearing. And you can go to the next slide, Sandy. Polar bears, which are, of course, kind of the poster children for the climate crisis a lot of times when you consider the disappearance of the ice in the Arctic and how that is affecting our polar bear populations. You can go to the next slide. Lots of aquatic and Arctic marine life depicted here. So when I started working more with images from Canadian wildlife, that's especially when I started thinking more about my climate anxiety, since these are more of creatures that I might encounter in my day-to-day. Not living in Saskatchewan, I won't encounter the killer whales, but certainly otters, and the loons like we saw in the first image. And you can go to the next slide, please. And finally, this is more what you'll see in the exhibition, where I've used light to cast a shadow, a very dramatic shadow, where you see the letters of fear spelt out. So thinking about how a lot of times we might go to nature to decompress and relax. But the more in recent years, usually if I'm going out camping or things, I still observe things that don't seem quite right, maybe like the amount of forest fires we had in the last year. So thinking that you can observe these beings on the surface, but maybe there's an underlying feeling of fear behind when you consider what's happening to our planet.
Wow, thanks, Rachel. It's exciting to see these brand new works. And one thing that struck me just as you went through your images there that hadn't struck me before was that image of the polar bears, how actually playful they all looked. And it underscored for me the difference between, how these wild animals or, elements of the natural environment are photographed and presented to people with one narrative, and really how powerful it is that you are kind of applying a totally different narrative to really reclaim some of the truth of our interaction with these wild animals and plants, plant life.
Yeah, and thank you for that, Sandy. And I still feel playful in my work and my approach to this topic, because while it's very serious that we need to take climate crisis really seriously, I think it's also an invitation for us to discuss it and make it more approachable, to put the polar bear in the room for us to consider.
Fantastic. I would like to now invite Dr. Hart again to show some examples that I think she's very excited to share that relate to what you're working on, Rachel.
Thank you, Sandy. Thank you, Rachel. And yes, the climate crisis, I think, is on everyone's mind, and it should be, because we've seen so many changes the last few years with weather patterns and outbreaks of disease. It's something that we need to take seriously and take action on. So having the ability to have those conversations is really crucial. And science needs help in having conversations, because we usually have things such as the loons here. This is how science handles the situation. So, we document over time, but often the conversations that scientists have aren't really welcoming to people. And so I think this is excellent to have your piece that, with the words shown in shadow, to engage conversation and bring in some of the biology and have those crucial conversations of what we're doing to our planet. So I've got here in response, these are baby loons, so super cute. They were collected, I believe, in the 60s. So the specimens that we use for a very long time. They're very important to us. And full disclosure, these are not loon eggs. They're the eggs of common terns. But I wanted to show them because, well, A, I didn't have loon eggs, and B, I thought they were a really good example of how animals adapt and evolve in their environments, because they have all this mottled coloration, and it really helps with them hiding and surviving. So it speaks to that idea of adaptability, but humans need to step up and help animals as they face, the pressures that we're putting on them. So yours, there's those eggs. They look really similar to common tern eggs, but I love all the loons. While I'm a little bit sad that we don't have an adult loon in our collection, I'm also a bit happy because it means that there's another loon out there that hasn't been brought into our collection for science. If we can move to the next slide, please. Thank you, Sandy. This one is one of my favorite skulls in our collection. You'll see it looks a little bit beaten up. That's because it's another specimen that is probably from the 60s. We inherited a lot of items when the university first opened. And so these are used in our teaching labs. Students get to handle them. So the skulls endure some wear and tear, but it's probably not evident in this photo. This is a massive polar bear skull. You can see there's a little bump at the back on the top. It's called a sagittal crest. This animal has huge muscles. So when I saw your picture, if you could advance, Sandy, of all those bears, interacting with each other, I immediately thought of the skull and those huge jaw muscles, because most of these bears have their mouths open, and just the incredible force that they would be able to deliver through a bite just added respect for these animals. And that's how I see them when I see a skull as a biologist. I see the features that would be there, the muscles, the teeth, the large eye sockets, all those features that indicate a little bit about the lifestyle of that animal. So this one, I really enjoyed seeing that because I got to show off a really cool skull. And it allows me to talk about, people think, oh, we just collect skulls as trophies. There's so much learning that can happen from a specimen like this one. Next one. This one, I had fun composing in response to your image. So I set it up left to right. So on the left, it might be hard to see, there is an otter skull. And instead of the one sea star, I've added a number of specimens from our teaching collections. We might be in the prairies, but we can order in specimens, and then they stay with us for a long time. And they get used for years and years of students to share the knowledge of each animal, what they have to show. I've got the hare in the middle there. There's a fox skull in front of it. And then one of the only whale bones we have in the collection, this giant vertebra. It's massive and it weighs a lot. And then off to the side, the only part of a seal that I have, the mandible. And they're still really important because the teeth are developed, they're modified for fish eating. And so they're unlike the teeth of what you would see on a dog or a deer. So it's really helpful when we get donations and can purchase specimens that students get to see all these differences and see the diversity of life. And, I do have artists who come in and also draw. So there's a nice connection there because there is an artistry to biology, and the students from the media art performance faculty come over and we also share specimens with them. And the next piece, please. Oh, this one surprised me. When I went to look through our collections, I was quite shocked to see the dried specimens out front. This is not typical of biology specimens. We don't dry them typically like this. The bracket fungus at the back left is typically dried. They're usually on trees, and so they wouldn't be upright as shown in this photo. We typically have things in jars. It's very sciencey that way. We keep them in preservatives so that you can see the characteristics that would typically dry up and not be viewable. So if you can see in the jars, you can see all those folds and intricacies. those might be lost in these dry specimens, but the dried specimens made me happy because they connect to the picture that you have, Rachel, where there was that nice red mushroom there. And I was just so excited that we actually had something representative of that in our collection, because usually things are in jars when they're soft-bodied like mushrooms are.
Oh, well, thanks, Mel, for digging out and sharing those items from the university's collection. And what I think is interesting is, you talked about how so much is discoverable. We can learn about animals or fungi through seeing these specimens and the different ways of preserving them. And then, interestingly, as this photograph of Rachel's work here, it reveals so much when we look at these photographs collaged together to make a word. I don't immediately recognize the letters, but in the shadow, I see the word spelled out, the word fear spelled out so clearly. And there's something kind of profoundly revealing about this experience of just engaging with something, sort of another level deeper. That's, I think important about both the way that Mel as a biologist, you would deal with objects, and then Rachel as an artist, the way that you are presenting things that are of concern to you.
That's something that I appreciated about seeing Mel's compositions of the specimens from the herbarium, because I work with images from these books. I can often feel maybe a little bit detached from the creatures that they're representing. It's just an image that I can manipulate into a collage. But seeing the specimen really grounds it in the fact that these are living beings, and seeing the skulls and things really brings that home.
And that's why they're so important. Our specimens are so important in teaching, because you can go to lecture and hear about things, but when you go to a lab and you get to hold something in your hands and see it and smell it, it brings a different level of learning into play. It's cool when you get to see the light bulb go off of, this is what the prof was talking about in class. Now I see what they mean about this particular type of teeth or this type of design on something. So I love the connections.
Thank you.
And I will invite artist Laurel Terlesky to share her work with us now and engage in conversation with Dr. Hart. Laurel Terlesky explores points of oversight and disconnect between technological interfaces and the need for nonverbal communication and implicit understanding, such as visual and touch, in her artworks. Her electronic integrated objects and drawings, activated by touch and motion, create situations for physical and tactile encounters. Terleski holds a Master of Fine Arts from Transarts Institute and a Bachelor of Fine Arts from the University of Victoria. Terleski's artworks have been televised, screened, and exhibited worldwide, and ask questions about the nature of embodiment. How are memories stored in our flesh? Why does touch unleash memories? How does the body mediate our past and future while remaining present?
Wonderful. Thank you, Sandy, for the introduction. And thank you so much for organizing this exhibition with all of these talented artists. It's so amazing to see everybody's work.
I'm also thrilled that you can all sort of meet in this forum.
Perfect. So this body of work that will be shown at the Art Gallery of Regina is from a body of work called The Tenacity of Hope. It's a series of drawings and sculpture elements. It was a long process for me to get at what you're seeing on screen right now. I'm a process-based artist, so usually I have some sort of inquiry into a topic like hope. And then I go about exploring those questions through a variety of materials. When I started to engage with hope, I was thinking about, what does hope mean when it's outside of thinking of it in terms of crisis, environmental crisis, political crisis, those types of things, and just seeing how it operates more for people in like a day-to-day kind of circumstance. So I did a few residencies throughout this work. The first residency was in Revelstoke, BC, and so I was essentially alone, like way up in the mountains, and I spent a lot of time wandering around, looking at plants and really wondering, you know, I really started to connect with the same topic that I think some of the other artists have mentioned of why we go to nature and how it kind of regenerates us, refuels us, gets us hopeful, thinking more positive. So with that, it definitely brought me down to, you know, working with plants and I was initially trying to build different sort of sculptures to represent a leaf or a flower. And then transitioning through that work, I went down to Richland in Washington, which is the home of Reactor B. And that's where the nuclear bomb was made that dropped on Nagasaki. So it was interesting being down there too and talking with students about hope. And a lot of what came to mind there was food scarcity and talking about the environment. And I did a fun exercise with them where they would put themselves into positions, you know, that expressed hope, or, you know, and these started to mimic the natural world too. So continuing on the same vein, I really started to go out into my local environment, look at the plants, and you know, even see how those plants are either outside in nature, or the fact of, you know, why are we bringing plants into our houses? What is connected with that? What's you know, a deeper layer with that? And so in thinking through a lot of this work, I started to think, oh my gosh, how is politics connected to this? What are the colonial histories connected to this? You know, how do plants all of a sudden start to represent global economies? Because looking around my own home, I have plants that have come from various different regions and that I've actually paid money for. So a lot of the work that you'll see here is representative of that thinking. The image that's on screen right now is a fern. This is from, I was living in Squamish at the time. And it reminds me of, I saw one of my friends who lives a block away from me, and she was carrying home a fern from the forest. And she was like, shh, don't tell anyone. And I thought, oh, that's so curious, you know, even though we have a beautiful forest that was a 5-minute walk away, why she needed it closer, why she needed to bring it into her home, you know, and care and cultivate for it. So this is where this image of the fern came from. In terms of developing the work, I like to take an isolated image, and then I spend a lot of time, it's almost like a meditation drawing. And then what you see on screen here is in starting to think about all these layers that come together, and just looking at a fern and maybe some of the travels it's been on, or some of the people that have visited it, or etc. There's layers of sort of a translucent paper of vellum that's on there, and then they're, you know, stitched and kind of pasted together with tape. And then on top of this, I wanted to create a real sense of interaction with these drawings to almost bring them to life with the viewer. And so if you get into the gallery to see these, and I've tried to show it here with my hand in there, but there's sewn electrical thread, and it's attached to a 3-volt battery. And you can see a Band-Aid, which is actually underneath that is a switch that my hand is going into to touch. And it essentially turns on a light at the other end of the fern. So all of a sudden we have a very complex system that I have interacted with to create something with this representation of a fern. Why don't we go to the next image? There we go. So here's another one. This also is from an area that was close to my home in Squamish, and this is salmonberry. Salmonberries are lovely when they come out. And so they're very close family to, I think, the raspberry and thimbleberries, and that favorite time when I can find them and maybe sneak some before the bears. Yeah, so this one does not have a switch on it. This one's just lights up on its own and will just keep running without any human interaction. So when I was developing this work, I felt like I needed to give some cues to the audience too as to what could happen, and maybe create some curiosity around the other ones that they needed to actually turn on and put a little effort into. We can go to the next one. This one is Blackberry. This one's curious because I did another residency through this work in Greece. I went to a little town called Leonidido, and it's very similar to Squamish in that it's kind of a climbing destination. But so I did a residency here, and I talked with a lot of the locals about what are their interactions with plants. Do they have any plants in their homes? And continuously, I found that they didn't have plants in their homes. They keep them outside in their yards, and they're very much seen. It's kind of a mountain town there, so they just see these as ways for food and for cultivation. And so backyards would be full of blackberries or lime bushes, or all the herbs that we're kind of familiar with, oregano, mint, that kind of thing. So this one is from a few of the drawings that I produced there for blackberry. It was in a yard of some people I had met. We'll go to the next one. And this one is a very common plant. I think that most of us would find at home, kind of that heart-shaped philodendron. People have them in pots, and maybe they're hanging down in their living room and that. So this is a very common plant. I can't recall where it's originally from. It might be from China. It might be from somewhere else. But it's a lovely plant. I love the ones that I have. But they've traveled. And they represent a connection back to the economy, whether someone picked one up at Home Depot or a friend gave them a cutting from one. And they sit in our houses, and we care and look after them, and essentially, cultivate a sense of hope with them as well. So I started engaging with all the plants around me and my friends that would have them too. So this shows those kind of conversations. If we go to the next slide. I did a little exhibition in Greece when I was there, just so I could give back to the community and also see how they would interact with this work and what they would say. It did stimulate a lot of conversation. People were really interested in being able to touch the drawings and see the light go on, and then start to talk about what the meanings were attached. So. And then, there's one more. So within the exhibition too, there'll be 3 sculptures that also come from this body of work. So this is a little bit, so if I go back to when I was doing the residency in Revelstoke, I'd be wandering around a lot at night and looking at the stars and thinking about hope, and if hope is light chasing. I think Yayoi Kusama has a really good line about, if you travel the world, in terms of light, you'd end up looking at the back of your head. So really meditating on that. And I did a series of sculptures and ended up in this form. What you're looking at here is kind of a tube that's made with lycra. And then I took salal leaves from my backyard, which are actually heavily affected by a lot of the climate crisis that we find ourselves in. Some of them are starting to disappear on Vancouver Island, I understand. Anyway, so I would go to an area very close to my house often, grab a couple leaves, say thank you to the plant, go back to my studio, and I made hundreds and hundreds of these air-dried clay leaf impressions, sort of capturing that salal leaf. And then these are sewed with red thread onto this lycra body. Inside is some electronics, and there's an accelerometer in there that can detect the sculpture's position in space, so your X, Y, Z position. And there's this piece that we're looking at doesn't have it, but the ones in the gallery will. It has a cord on the bottom, so a person can pick that up and move the sculpture around, and it will cause a series of lights to go off. So, and you can see those here on the right. This was from, what you're looking at here was, I took this work to Cape Breton Island for a show, an outdoor light show there. It was really fun because I really got to experiment with the pieces and talk with the community about what it was. And it was, it's really interesting how people could see that this was related to the natural world, but it was slightly detached. And then just this feeling of delight and joy when they actually cause the lights to come on, and then look at it a little bit closer and to investigate the leaves. So lots of really good conversations generated from this work.
Well, Laurel, thank you for sharing again the work that's going to be in the exhibition, and it just really awakens in me so much anticipation to be able to see and interact with these works in person in the gallery and for our viewers as well. And one thing that I was, again, when I hear the artists and see them present their work, sometimes things will impact me. And I thought about this act of people touching this Band-Aid on the drawing and how it's kind of a caring caress. But also in both of the pieces that you're showing here, the impact of people on plants. As you said, it could be this act of care, but there are other kinds of impacts that humans have on plant life, including a kind of history of colonial resource extraction and a commodification of plants.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a very good call out. These in my experiments of first showing this work before I arrived at the final body, that was just it. I knew almost, I had like a library of experiences of how people, what they could do to affect this work, and some of it was good, some of it was bad, but it was, it's like you can't. There's always a relationship between the two pieces, and it was very evident by this work.
All right, well, thank you. And I would like to once again invite Dr. Hart to join us and to discuss with you both your work and some examples from the herbarium.
Thank you, Laurel. In response, I had fun finding some pieces. I found this collection a little bit more challenging because it really made me think outside the box. So for the first one, I chose this one. I love ferns, as I mentioned before. I'm from the West Coast, and this one speaks of tenacity and hope to me, because if you probably can't see it on the label, but you can see it in the growth form of the fern. This specimen was collected from a cliff. And so if anything speaks to tenacity and hope, it's this plant being able to find a space to grow and thrive on the side of a cliff. And if we can move to the next slide, please, Sandy. So one back. I liked how it connected with that idea of tenacity and hope. And it reminded me of some of the ferns that I've seen on the coast. And so it's not as large a specimen, but I liked just that straight word connection just from the collection label. Next slide, please, Sandy. Now, this one I thought would be good in terms of connecting to a prairie plant West Coast perspective. This is in response to the Salmonberry piece that you showed. And in listening to your description of it, I like how you describe it as the light work keeps running without human interaction. And I think that's really true of cacti. They're very hardy plants, and they really don't need people around to interfere and interrupt their lives. And so there's that connection, as well as just the comparison to prairie life and West Coast plants. So there's the Salmonberry. And like I said, I liked how you stated it really didn't need interaction for it to do what you wanted to for its piece. Next slide, please, Sandy. This one is a raspberry, a native raspberry to Saskatchewan, and it's in response to the blackberry. So I'm used to seeing lots of blackberry from living on Vancouver Island, and I don't see them out here, but I was pleased to see that we do have native raspberries. And so just, again, looking at the difference in the landscape between prairie existence and West Coast existence, I've had to rethink what I consider to be a typical plant in my environment. Next slide, please, Sandy. And the wolf willow, this is another plant that I didn't know about until I moved to Regina. this I'm going to use to speak to the philodendron and the salal leaves. I didn't know about wolf willow before I came to Regina. And so to me, it's another example of recognizing the plants in your local environment and taking more appreciation for them. So we do see a lot of commodification of plants. We bring a lot of house plants in from, like the philodendron, from tropical areas and the West Indies, and we love them, but there's a lot of really cool specimens just outside our doors. And, you know, in talking about the salal leaves, I was thinking about the comment that they're becoming fewer and fewer in the environment. And I think that really connects nicely with wolf willow because it's spreading very readily. Since moving here in 2015, I've seen it in more and more locations. So while we see some plants moving out of an environment, being exterminated from an environment, really being negatively impacted by climate change, there are plants that thrive with those changing conditions and really take advantage of it. And I did like the description of the accelerometer. We're bringing some physics and different types of science into that piece. So thank you for sharing your works with me, Laurel. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Mel. I'm amazed to see the collection from the herbarium too, because some of the fern, I had no idea that there are ferns in, I'm guessing that was from Saskatchewan. I had no idea that a fern would be there.
We have a lot of plants here that I'm really surprised that we have, but there are many different ecoregions. So we might not see some of the specimens down south in Regina, but as you go up north and hit boreal forest, there's a whole new world. It's amazing.
Incredible. Yeah, it speaks to all the detail that's out there.
One thing that also struck me so much was this parallel between the way that you assemble your drawings, Laurel, with all of these strips of white tape, and the way that these specimens would be collected and shown in the herbarium. Sorry, I'm just looking for a picture where we can see more of the tape. This one's got some very fine pieces of tape. But
yeah, actually, I wanted to mention that too, because when I was looking at the images that Mel sent, I was like, oh, there's something so oddly familiar with how I framed some of the drawings. And it got me questioning, because I went back and read this paper that I had developed on this work. And I talk a lot about the complexity of systems. And also when it comes to talking about the plants, the interconnection of the plant species and how they use that for survival. And yet we, you know, when we're extracting certain plants and putting them in isolation in our homes, how we're, you know, changing that system in a way. So it's interesting to me that I did my drawings in this isolated way to really think through this moment. But it's, you know, there's so much more that these things connect to, which is, yeah, part of that, like, detail of science that opens us up to the bigger picture, I think. But a striking similarity.
I will now be inviting Alyssa to join us on screen and to present her work. Alyssa Ellis is a multidisciplinary artist whose work with plants reveals social ills and the impact of climate change. Seemingly botanical subjects reveal the multifaceted relationships of care, disregard, and exploitation by humans of members of the plant kingdom. Ellis holds a diploma in horticulture from the University of Guelph and a Bachelor of Fine Arts from the Alberta College of Art and Design, and has participated in festivals, exhibitions, and residencies across the country.
So thank you, Sandy. That was fantastic. And thank you for having me here today, and for connecting all of us artists together, and to Mel. This is a still from my 2018 performance called Plant Vacation, where I invited people to take their plants on vacation. This took place at the Illingworth Kerr Gallery, that is at AU Arts in Calgary, Alberta. And The building, if you've ever been to it, it's quite stark, quite depressing to be in. So a lot of the offices and a lot of the students in their studios will keep plants in their spaces to very much liven them up. And as a student there, you'd always see plants when you're walking through the hallway. And after I graduated, I wanted to go back and I wanted to offer an experience to the plants that I saw in these spaces by inviting them to go on vacation with me. So students or faculty in the university could sign their plant up for myself to come pick them up from their studio or office. And I would actually take them on a tour of the space and invite them to different areas of the university that they would never usually see, as they were usually kept in their office spaces. And at the end of our little tour, we would go, there I am, actually taking a plant out of the office. And I would put them into a little wagon and I would, like I said, take them around. And at the end of the tour, we would go back to the gallery where all of the plants were invited to go through a spa treatment with me. So that involved either washing or trimming, repotting, dusting, and anything that you could kind of really think of that a plant might need for its care. And while this was happening, the plants were listening to a 1970s soundtrack of plant-specific music, so they could really get into that mindset of calm and care and feel better about themselves. And once the performance was complete, the plants are returned to their office spaces where they would most likely live out the rest of their lives until whoever was in that space moved on with them. This is my 2019 performance called Plant Adoption. I have this philosophy that plants should be accessible to everyone. Plants should be free, and we should be able to invite plants into our lives at any point. There's a large barrier that I identified while learning or doing my horticulture diploma between what people can afford and what people can actually obtain. And plants became something that people sometimes couldn't afford to have in their lives because they are expensive. If you've ever been to a greenhouse, you'll see that it'll be, $10 to $15 for just a small plant. And I really think that people should be able to bring them into their lives at any point. So I offered to send people home with plants by adopting them out. I would collect plants from different places in my community, and that could be from dumpsters, off of free sites, from people who are offering cuttings, and I would propagate them, clean them up, and I would give them away to people during an adoption process. So during this performance, I would have people come to my table that was set up in Lethbridge, and they would ask to take a plant home. I'd ask for them to present a vessel to take that plant home and for that plant to live in that vessel. And that vessel could be a cupping of hands, it could be their pocket, it could be a pot they brought, it could be their shoe. And whatever they brought me, they had to promise that that plant would grow for the rest of its life, cared for in that vessel. And so this little girl in the photo here, she offered her hands to me and she was able to take home her very first Hoya. This was another iteration of plant adoption called Plant Swap, where I would have people bring plants to myself and we would trade them back and forth. And I ended up doing this at nightclubs. So this was at a Femwave Festival in Calgary. And we were set up at the back of a bar and people could come in and swap plants with myself or take something home. It was supposed to be a really fun experience and really intervene into places where you wouldn't normally find plants, and people really enjoyed being able to come to the back of the bar and be able to take a plant home that was specially wrapped up for them to put in their coat pocket. And this was a newer work that I actually made during lockdown. So a lot of my work involves going to people's houses to meet different people, to see what kind of plants they have, either for care purposes or for collection purposes. And during the pandemic, I was unable to do that. And I found myself sitting at home and reading and seeing a lot of news in regards to the plant community. And something that really struck me is that while we were in lockdown, a lot of the borders were closed and a lot of plant trading wasn't able to take place. So there would be large shipping containers full of plants that would end up dying at the border because there would be no one to actually inspect them and no greenhouses to take them in order to ensure that they receive the proper care. And so greenhouses would end up keeping their plants, keeping their entire stock held back because no one was able to purchase them. And these greenhouses would become graveyards. And so they would just be full of deceased plants, and it became a real issue for a lot of people in the horticulture society. And at the same aspect, something that I've really come across, especially while collecting plants to give to other people in order for them to have access to them, is that there are a lot of people who collect plants, and collecting plants can be a love sickness. You can become addicted to it. You can fully find yourself completely engulfed in a community where you need to have the newest, the best, the biggest, the brightest, the most colorful plant. And it became unfortunate because it would actually drive up plant costs and prices for people who wouldn't be able to necessarily afford them. And so both of these pieces here are hand embroidered and hand quilted onto grass photos, very common plants that we find across all of our urban environments.
Wow.
That was a mouthful.
Oh, thanks, Alyssa. I hope I didn't distract you with my snickering about plant swap at a bar and using the solo cups, a famous component of drinking games to to disseminate plants. One thing that you touched on here that I think is so important is this capitalization of plants, this monetization of plants within the capitalist system, and also how many times you are taking plants, rescuing plants from dumpsters, things that have been considered worthless in a monetary way. And you know, that's often, I think, analogous to the work that an artist does, that, you know, artists take things that are worthless without the action of the artist to make it into an artwork that's something that can be valued for its beauty or for the insights that it gives us.
Yes, definitely. It's kind of crazy when you go dumpster diving for plants and you end up, I'll go to, usually greenhouses won't let you do it. They'll lock the dumpster. But if you go behind florist shops or event centers, you'll find entire dumpsters full of things that people would love to be able to cherish, to bring into their home because they are expensive and they're also a living thing. And so for us to so casually decide that it's not even worth the time, it's not even worth the effort, it just goes into the dumpster is something that's baffling to think that that's how we treat another living thing.
Yeah, it is quite horrifying, especially with the spread of the term plant parent, to think that all of the plant babies are just thrown in the garbage, quite literally.
Yes.
Again, I'm going to invite Dr. Hart to join us on screen, and I'm going to duck out. Enjoy your conversation.
Thank you, Sandy. Thank you, Alyssa. I like the idea of respecting plants and viewing them as these living beings that we should take care of and give attention to, because they do deserve it. And so in response to that, like, I have this picture of the collecting gear from the the herbarium. I thought it spoke in a way to the plant vacation pictures, because it's kind of like a permanent vacation that we give the plants that get collected.
It's a retirement.
Yeah, but they are treated with utmost respect, because each specimen is so valuable in science. The information that each plant collected holds is priceless, basically. So you can kind of see here, there's some magnifying glasses. People do look at each specimen very closely. Some of those small flowers, the small nutlets. There's a white container. It's basically like a really long lunchbox. And so when people go out and collect, they collect specimens and they hold them in the plant box to bring them back to the herbarium. You've also got some scissors there. And then it might be hard to see, but there are notebooks, because there's so much information about collecting sites that needs to be detailed on those labels. So it's a different form of care. We are, giving them that retirement home instead of a vacation.
Of course. Even like, I just wanted to interrupt there, Mel. When the specimens come into the herbarium, there is a whole process they have to go through. Specimens aren't just put into the collection. Am I right?
Exactly. So the pictures that you show of collecting the plants from the offices and having them out on the table, dusting them off, it all connects to what we do for plant specimens in the herbarium. The dirt that's on roots doesn't just get thrown into the collection. It's carefully brushed off. The plants are lovingly squashed in between press boards. Details are given, and time is put into preparing those specimens. So I could see that connection. If we can go to the next slide, please, Sandy, with the ferns. This one, I really liked how, like, I was thinking that care element shows up here, because the plants have been spaced very nicely. They've been taped with care. There's almost, to me, an artistry in how they're presented. But then when you were speaking about the plant adoption, with the picture on the next slide, I think, with the young girl, adopting her first plant, it made me think about how collecting plants is something that pretty much anyone with access to cardboard and some heavy books can do. So it is affordable. It's an affordable pastime. And, part of looking at the herbarium and trying to digitize the collection, we want to make those specimens available to everyone. So I liked that connection as well. Like I see some really strong parallels between.
Yes.
It's fantastic.
When the herbarium receives collections too, they come from private donations as well, right? So you might even have somebody outside of Regina who has this amazing collection that you're not even going to see, and they could have the most valuable plant collected in your area, right?
Yeah.
And you're not going to know until later on.
Exactly, and that came up with the plant trading idea. Maybe the next slide, please, Sandy. Keep going. Yes, the herbarium cabinets, it's not so as important, but this idea of trading specimens and us taking in other collections, it happens all the time. We trade with other herbaria because we have specimens they want, they have specimens we want. And so there's this exchange of the dead plants as well, because they all are very valuable. And we do take care. So I know the cabinet may look boring, but every single plant has its own unique home. It's all organized in a very particular fashion. So we know exactly where each plant is living in its retirement home. So I like that now. The retirement home sounds much nicer than her.
I don't know. They're pretty good. They're both good.
But it sounds better than, like a death collection. So
A little bit, just a teeny bit.
yeah, just a little bit. A lot of people don't realize the care that goes into the specimens. And this one, this lady slipper that I have up, I think it speaks very nicely to this idea of plant collecting as a love sickness and perhaps becoming a little bit bad in some ways. In the 1800s, plant collecting was accessible to everyone, and it was good because in science, women weren't really invited to participate in science, but this was one of the things that they could do, and it was considered decent and okay for women to have collections of plants. But then as popularity grew amongst men and women to collect plants, there became that competitive nature and over-harvesting, and something that started off with good intentions kind of derailed and took a dark path. So I think it's important to remember that all these things that start out with good intentions can go a little bit sideways. Yeah. There can be too much of a good thing.
Too much of a good thing, I think, is the best way to put it. It can get pretty violent out there.
Yeah, and poor plants. I mean, they're sitting there providing oxygen and doing their thing, and we come along and we commodify them.
Exactly. And I don't know if you see it at the herbarium, but I mean, in botanical gardens right now, there's a real issue with people going through, and just like they did, at the turn of the century, they were breaking in and they're stealing plants, they're taking cuttings, or they're digging up whole specimens. And I don't know if you see that in the herbarium, community, where people are actually taking specimens from you.
Luckily, the herbarium is under lock and key. And that's part of the reason we want to digitize it, right? Because we don't have the people power to have someone sit there every day and invite people in and watch, right? So if we digitize, it keeps the specimens safe because people handling them can easily break them. They're very fragile specimens. And you do have people who might be tempted to take a souvenir. So the more I do see it on campus, though, because we do have lots of plants all over campus, and people come and take cuttings and trimmings, and they harvest their own part of that plant. So, luckily, they're the type of plants that survive that type of behavior. Yeah, plants are definitely very popular, more so, I think, than they ever have been.
Yes. I would agree.
Hi, yes, thank you both. What a rich conversation. Before I invite the other artists to join us, I did just want to make one last observation, which maybe could be the starting point for our short group discussion, which is that I noticed that Alyssa, with her oftentimes green hair, her floral and foliage printed dresses, is kind of blurring this line between human and vegetal. And I think that this is something to consider in terms of the interconnectedness of all life, and also how we ethically engage with other forms of life, including plants, whether they be alive or dead, to not objectify them, turn them, to commodify them, or to discard them so callously, but to value them and to learn from them. And so I thank you, all the artists here, for presenting that perspective.
I'd like to thank everyone for letting me see a different perspective, because in science it's very structured, and it was refreshing to see a different perspective of plants. Like each art piece, I had so much fun looking through the collection, trying to find an answer and having the back and forth discussions. It was amazing, and I really appreciate that.
Yeah, so we'll see. I was gonna do the.
Yeah, I really enjoyed seeing how the specimen from the herbarium connected with everyone's work unintentionally, like Laurel noticed with her drawings or the collecting gear with Alyssa. So that's pretty cool to see all those connections drawn out.
I find it interesting on how connected we all are, like on our studies of plants and how we respect them and we observe them through a kind eye. And I think that was really an interesting thing to see. Like through my ancestors as medicine women, we were taught that you only take what you need, and you leave some for the bears, you leave some for the bees, you leave some for the birds. So you only take what you need, and there's always an offering that is taken place whenever you harvest and that sort of thing. So it's that common respect thing for the natural world, and I think that's very, very, very important in this day and age because our ecology has been so greatly affected, and through the effects of colonization to the harm that's happening in our own natural world today through the oil and gas industry or a myriad of many different effects to our natural world. So I always say when I'm talking about the plants, you have to fight for the little guy.
I found it interesting too how all of us seem to point to an aspect, that these are living beings, and to bring, whether it's that care or that they have healing properties to them. I don't think one of us thought of any of these things as just an object, of a distant, even in Mel, your conversations with what's in the herbarium, it's all these, like what is represented in that living being and how does it connect into its ecosystem and how do we, it was really cool to really see that present amongst everyone.
Yes, I agree, Laurel. I think so many of us separate plant life from human life. And it's very hard, especially with a lot of our teachings, to bring that back together. There isn't, in our urban environments, we don't really live with nature in balance. We don't really think of plants on an equal playing field as us, even though they are so important and integral for us to continue to live. But we disregard, we destroy relationships, and we decide that us as the human are a more important form of life than the plant is.
I've asked a similar question. I was looking at houseplants. I was like, so do you consider this plant in terms of the light it's getting in your living room or maybe airflow or that? Or are you looking at it because it looks really good next to the couch?
Exactly. And I think that's something that I see a lot in my work when I go into people's houses and they're getting rid of plants. And I find those conversations to be the most interesting things that I will ever see. First off, you get to go into someone's house and you get to see how they live, which is always entertaining upon itself. But second is you have somebody who's giving away something that's so precious. And there was this one plant that I wanted to bring up, and I'm bringing cuttings of her to give away as part of the adoption. Her name is Molly, and Molly is a Hoya carnosa. And I met her about 3 years ago, right before the pandemic. And she was one of my plant pickups where a family decided that they could no longer live with her. And it was the most interesting interaction I've ever had with a family and their plant, because they built this very, very intimate bond with it, where when I showed up to collect it and to take it home, there were 3 people who carried Molly out, and they had their vines draped across their arms, and they carried her out of the house, and it was like a funeral procession. And they loaded her into my car, and they didn't want to say goodbye, but they determined that the space that they had wasn't the right space for Molly anymore, and they wanted it to go to a place where others could enjoy it. And I think that was one of the most beautiful things I'd ever seen in regards to a houseplant, was this relationship, this care that they built together.
I
That's
was
such,
really, sorry.
oh, I was just going to say that's such an extraordinary story, Alyssa. And it did make me also think of you, Heather. And Mel and I, again, in our conversations over the last little while, have talked about, the scientific protocols for collecting a plant specimen. And I think for you, when you are gaining this traditional knowledge of medicine plants from your territory with your mother, there are probably also protocols in place and this kind of, as Alyssa had shared in her story, this kind of care for the plant as a very important being in our lives.
I was really interested in the fact that there's an exchange that happens amongst students in universities. So, like in the forms of my historical research, and that way of kind of carrying on those traditions from one to another, I think that's really interesting. And a lot of some of the others have highlighted the kind of ecology and the effects of ecology that has happened. I think that's a really exciting thing. And you talked a bit about the willowberry. Is that correct?
Wolf willow, yeah.
Wolf willow. Sorry, I know wolf willow. You can actually feed with them. So wolf willow is like a tradition that I think is interesting. And I know also that wolf willow was it's thriving here in Alberta in strange areas as well. And I think it has to do with the dryness of the soil and more sand. Is that correct in your area?
Well, we certainly have. We've had drier years the last few years. Open disclosure, my background is not in botany, so I don't know about the soil type, but I wouldn't be surprised if the conditions have changed so much with the change in climate that now it's just allowing that plant to take over. And you know, the beading that you mentioned, the seeds are so beautiful on that plant. They come up with beautiful stripes. Like, it's an amazing plant, but it really is kind of taking over the environment here.
That's quite cool. It's so valued to get those beads. I forgot to wear mine today, which would have been so appropriate, but yeah, I think that's really interesting. I also find it really interesting because I did some research up in Lac La Biche and northern up by Cold Lake, and while I was up there, I was noticing that there's like a fungus that is going on the willows up there, and they seem to be having a lot of problems. And in former works of mine where I studied primrose and the air weapons range, there's like extreme contamination of the water tables up there. We don't have enough time. I could go on endlessly about that, but I find that really threatening for our natural world when we see things like that. And you know, I was just wondering for the herbarium, for those harvests that they're taking place, they're working with the Indigenous communities to talk about some of those other teachings. Is that happening?
I teach ecology classes and physiology classes, and we're very fortunate here to have First Nations University of Canada on our doorstep. And so for my classes, I've been working with elders to do recordings around the native plants here. They get shared with, those teachings get shared with the students, with the idea that that knowledge doesn't die then when that elder is no longer with us. We haven't been bringing it into the herbarium simply because we haven't been bringing in new specimens recently. So going forward, our goal is to take those specimens that we currently have, put them online, and get everything like cataloged. We only have those books right now that I showed you in the picture. That's not easily accessible for people online. So we're putting everything into digital format, tidying everything up. And then going forward, if we do collect, then yes, we would consult with community and make sure that we're collecting in a good way. I know Dr. Ledingham was really respectful, but I know that some practices have been a little bit sketchy in the past in science, and we don't want that to continue. We want to make sure that we're doing things properly.
Interesting.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And like I said, I'm very excited for you to connect through this online forum prior to the exhibition. Some of you will be able to attend the exhibition and experience each other's work and connect at that time. And I did want to also draw everyone's attention to the fact that the title of the exhibition, We Are All Electric Beings, did come from some knowledge that Shillinglaw shared with Heather. And when I repeated that to the biologists at the Ledingham Herbarium, they were all extremely excited because this exactly mirrored what, as biologists, they know to be true, that every plant has an electrical charge on its cells. So, you know, I'm really excited that we can kind of come together through this electronic medium. We're all electronic beings on this video meeting.
Anahita That means awesome.
Okay, well, thank you so much, everyone. And then I will kind of wrap up our discussion, the recorded discussion of how artists and biologists see plants differently. And of course, thank you to Mel, Rachel, Alyssa, Heather, and Laurel for sharing your thoughts, words, and time. Thank you to our viewers for taking the time to watch this recorded conversation. Along with our funders, your support makes it possible for the Art Gallery of Regina to offer free and affordable activities like this. You can support the Art Gallery of Regina by becoming a member, donating, or both. Visit our website, www.artgalleryofregina, for details on becoming part of our gallery's community. While you're on our website, check out the Art Gallery of Regina's online and in-person programming, especially our Culture Days activities that invite people to understand their role as part of the land, intimately connected with all the living things around us. I look forward to seeing you in person in the gallery at 2420 Elphinstone Street to view the exhibition We Are All Electric Beings.